let's jump in a little bit to kind of the effect of all this on Huawei. The first question is a little more for Nalin, I think, on the technical side, although I think any of us here could probably answer it, but I think Nalin's the best. This ban, which basically, in layman's terms, bans any use of foreign technology for chip designs. The thing is, of course, chips are used in everything these days. And so a lot of people are talking about the Kirin chips and the handsets and all of that, and the access to data there, backdoors. But there's also a whole other business line of Huawei of telecoms equipment, which we've talked about a bit already as well. But cloud, AI, is this basically affect almost all of Huawei's business lines?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so we talked a lot about Kirin, which is sort of what I would call the client end of things, right, or the edge aspect of it. But telecom equipment is also required to drive your 5G, your infrastructure, 5G infrastructure, right? Your networking aspects, your switching aspects, and there's some pretty complex chips that go behind that as well. So it affects everything across that 5G network in a sense, and how you roll it out. If you look at the market, the telecom network market in general, frankly, it was kind of a three-party monopoly, right? It was Nokia, Ericsson, and Huawei, each one of them with their own custom, fully vertically integrated solution, hardware-based solution, and completely vertically integrated. Nokia and Ericsson were probably 50% more expensive than Huawei, and that's why Huawei had sort of a good adoption across the board with a lot of markets as well, right? But in a sense, that market was already sort of between three monopolies or three companies that were dominating that whole infrastructure for telecom networks. With Huawei sort of not being in the picture, there are a couple of things here. One is, so regardless of whether Huawei is in the picture or not, I think consumers needed more choice. That's sort of my view. Or basically countries needed more choice on technology, on adoption of this, right? So there are a few things that are coming up now. Think about things like Open RAN and virtual networks. These are technologies where you can standardize on standard components and push more of the network aspects in a software sort of layer, and have third-party suppliers play now in the game. So for example, in Japan, Rakuten has just rolled out what they call a 4G virtual network, right, based on this type of technology. So I think regardless of whether Huawei is in the market or not, there was a need for more suppliers, and there was a need for new technologies to bring sort of more options and expansion of 5G rollouts and infrastructure out there. But yes, this will have a big impact on Huawei just because semiconductor chips are sort of 5G chips are the oil, whether it's on the mobile side or in the infrastructure, right? That's the new oil in a sense. So it's going to have an impact across the board for Huawei.
So let's take a poll, quick straw poll here. What do we think is going to happen to Huawei after this? Put you guys on the spot a bit. Don't all jump in at once.
That's a tough one.
I think there's going to be some struggle for the near-term foreseeable future.
Yeah, I say.
Go ahead.
I say there's going to be short-term pain, of course, but we also know how China has been very good innovating domestically over a long period of time, right? In terms of investments and made in China 2025. I actually think that's very that's admirable, right? If you look at it from the US perspective, I think we're missing, to be honest, I think we're missing parts of that in the US. That drive to do more R&D and innovation has sort of been lost in the US in a sense, right? So there will be short-term pain for Huawei, but I do think given the connections that they have and the investment that China can make, they can overcome that. They also do drive a lot of the other market segments in Africa, Middle East, where Huawei has a very strong footing. So there is business there for Huawei, which I don't think they're going to be, in a sense, taken out of, right? China as a country has invested a lot in Southeast Asia and Africa quite heavily, if you think about it. And that plays into what Huawei can do in those markets as well. So I don't think they're going to just die, but there will be short-term pain.
I'm with Nalin on this one. I'm actually very bullish. I will say that, first of all, money is not a problem in China. It's just printing money. So hurting financially Huawei on their consumer business, it's not really going to affect them. They just opened a new fund to actually invest in 5G and machine learning technology. So obviously the money is not an issue. They maybe need that trigger, that constraints to drive innovation and to foster in China a domestic R&D center. So Huawei always been saying that they were innovating in the UK actually with their R&D center in London, always playing that card of being a European player. And I think that's maybe the kick that they need to rise as a domestic Chinese champion. So I will be very bullish about this and essentially say that they have a good shot. The only thing that they might miss is the brain juice. Simply put, it's not just money, it's not just infrastructure, it's not just a big sandbox to develop stuff that you need to become a leading manufacturer. It's also a lot of brain power. So right now, is there enough in China? I don't know. There sure is in the US. So is China going to be an attractive place enough for foreign talent to choose China over the US or Europe? That's really going to be a key question over the next few months and few years.
Yeah, I mean, I just add on to that point a little bit as well. I think there's no shortage of engineering talent here in China, and there's no shortage of financing here in China, and there's no shortage of motivation to build an entirely self-contained infrastructure and ecosystem that can support Huawei without having to rely on US technology. But yet you hit on it, Nico, which is that it's stitching all this talent together into and taking and starting from a lower base, essentially. As you know, you need, starting from when Nalin and I were back at Cadence, you need EDA tools to do the design of your system. That's a lot of code that's been built on previous code, on previous code, on previous code, and a lot of bugs that have been fixed along the way. You've got the whole design cycle all the way to when you do actual manufacturing at, you know, your choices of TSMC or others, Samsung, Intel does its own, but. And then you have SMIC in China, which is at least a couple generations behind on the latest nodes of nanometer for manufacturing. I think they can do 14 nanometer now, but we're already on 10 and 7 at TSMC for a few years now. So SMIC just did a huge IPO, and by delisting from New York and coming here and doing one onshore in Shanghai on the STAR market. But again, that's just a money thing, and so you need the DNA and you need the know-how built up from all that. That's maybe a good segue then into that question, which topic we wanted to hit on, which is, you know, can we see any national champions coming up? I think Nalin might be able to help on this one a little bit, sort of both on the design side and on the foundry side, and everything else in the mix. And what's a good estimate for when you might be able to start catching up?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it on the foundry side, I think the foundry aspect is probably more critical because chip manufacturing is probably one of the most sophisticated manufacturing processes in the world, right? You can find design engineers to build chips. You can hire engineers to build chips, SoC engineers, and so on and so forth, right? But to fabricate the chip, that's a whole different story. We're talking about very complex lithography. We're talking about very complex processes. That's going to be the hard part. And I think that's where most of the immediate investment has to go as far as China is concerned. Chinese Chinese companies have been designing chips for a very long time. They haven't been fabricating advanced node chips, right? That's the key thing here. So, and when you go into volumes such as 5G, where those types of volumes, you really need to be going into those advanced nodes to make them economical, right? The 7 nanometers, for example, the 14 nanometers, etc., 5 nanometers down the road, right? And that's where I see that the investment has to happen. A couple of articles I just read, I think a couple of days ago, something that piqued my interest were investments into sort of investments that two fabrication plants were making in China, Quanxin IC, and pardon me for not pronouncing it right, and Hongxin Semiconductor Manufacturing. I think one's based in Wuhan, not sure where the other one is based. So QXIC and HSMC, right? And they've hired 100 engineers between them over the last 6 months or so from TSMC, paying them basically 2x the salary that they make in Taiwan, for example, right? So they seem like they have a plan. They seem like, okay, we're going to use these two foundries. They're going to focus on ramping up 7 nanometer processes and 5 nanometer processes down the road. They're saying the timing for that is 7 nanometer is going to be somewhere in the 2022 timeframe. I'm doubtful about that, but that's sort of a general guideline. I see that these investments may be bearing fruit in about 3 to 4 years. It does take a very long time to bring up this sort of expertise. So I would say 3 to 4 years from now, they could be in a position to sort of being able to produce enough yields or quantity of chips that they need at those advanced nodes. But that's where I think the critical investment is going to happen and is happening from what I can tell.
Just as a, maybe as a useful info, and Nalin, you can confirm that the Kirin ban is a big blow for Huawei because it took them about 10 years to develop, to engineer. So the development, the engineering phase is quite long for chips. It's not something you can just roll out in a couple of months.
Yeah, and this was a market, that particular mobile chipset market was, for a very good reason, dominated by one vendor for a very long time, which was Qualcomm, right? Because it is quite complex to get the processing, but also the communication aspects of it, right? So, and now there's other players, of course. There's MediaTek in the market who have done quite a good job. There's NVIDIA there in the market, which sort of is not clear where they are now in that space anymore. They might come back in the market. Looks like they're looking at buying ARM, so who knows what will happen with all that. And then there's Samsung, right, with their offerings and so on and so forth. So that particular mobile chipset market is sort of very difficult to get into and succeed in because of the reliability required and then quality of communication required on those chips and baseband chips and so on and so forth, right? So true, but I also think on the other hand, they've gone through the process of actually designing a mobile chipset, which many companies haven't, right? So there's about 3 or 4 companies that have done it. Even Intel hasn't been as successful as Huawei in designing a mobile chipset. So that gives you an idea, right? So I think that experience actually holds up very well for Huawei now. So.
You mentioned ARM, and something interesting that sort of popped up in my newsfeed recently, I think even just this morning, was that that ARM now has an exclusive cooperation with DARPA for the next few years in the U.S. And so, with those chips being cut off from Huawei, for example, and now being, access is essentially being given to DARPA almost exclusively. Well, not exclusively, but for the purposes of this project or these projects, I think that's a big development, and that dovetails in with Nalin, what you were saying earlier about the need for heavy investment in R&D and things like that in the U.S. that has sort of fallen off, right? So when you mentioned that and ARM, I was reminded about this, and so that indicates a little bit that I think this is on the U.S.'s radar, the need to really invest heavily and focus on the R&D side of this, because that's what DARPA does, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the U.S. can catch up, or I don't want to say catch up when it comes to chip design, because the US has been doing it for a long time, but where it's sort of been blindsided is the fabrication of chips, which is again all being done pretty much in Taiwan, right? So
yeah.
that is going to be pretty hard for the US to catch up at this point. So they need to be thinking about, Taiwan is becoming very strategic at this point in many different ways for both countries, right? So
Intel just had its most recent slip up, right? So there's not looking good. But I have a question for you, Nalin. You mentioned, let's say it's going to take, it might be not too long down the path where they're going to get to, let's say, 7 nanometers, or where it's going to be cost efficient for 5G. Of course, US companies are not standing still either, and they're going to keep getting smaller. Now, then you also have Moore's law in there as well, which maybe we're going to hit some physics limits at some point. But I guess my question is that good enough? If they get to, let's say, 7 nanometers, do they have to keep getting better to get those economics and to keep rolling out their network at scale on 5G? Or is it going to give them a long-term disadvantage if they can't keep catching up to, let's say, other technologies?
No, I think I think once they get to 7 and 5, I think they're going to be on par for a very long time, right? Until the next big thing comes. And I think the next big thing is still a while away, because even 5G to me is, like I said, a couple of years ago, I would have said 5G is a solution looking for a problem. So, right. So I think that will, once they get to 5, 7 and 5 nanometers, that will hold them in pretty good stead. And that's sort of my view.